All right. Welcome, everybody. We're really excited to have you here with us. I'm Karen Lightman, Executive Director of Metro 21 Smart Cities Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. And I'm really excited. This is the number 2 in our series talking about justice and technology. We're honored to have an amazing lineup of speakers today. And also this is brought to you in collaboration with Heinz College at Carnegie Mellon University, as well as our sister organization, Traffic 21 at Carnegie Mellon. So I'm going to just do a quick few slides here. Metro 21, for those of you who don't know, we have smart cities in our name, and we're talking about how you use 21st century technology developed at Carnegie Mellon by our researchers and faculty, and using it to solve real world problems in collaboration with our municipal and equity partners. And we are, oh good, Tara's here. We are all about collaboration, co-creation, partnership. We do everything thoughtfully, intentionally, iteratively. And if we don't, we learn the hard way, it doesn't work. We've deployed probably 60 plus projects since our founding in 2015. I just celebrated my 4-year anniversary, which is crazy. And today, we're going to talk about this issue of justice and technology. And it really came about after conversations starting last summer. And also, what a year and a half we've all had, and really an understanding of what is the role of technology in enabling and improving quality of life. Ideally, you're using this technology to improve efficiency, improve safety and health, and hey, launch some startups, that's great. But sometimes there's unintended consequences. So what do you do about that? How do you, we believe at Carnegie Mellon is you do pilot projects, you do small time-bound projects in collaboration, and then you iterate and you evaluate. But sometimes the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater, right? It's like, okay, no facial recognition. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about social issues, social justice issues, environmental justice issues. What are those unintended consequences that sometimes happen? And then, if we want to uphold the sustainable development goals, how do we measure ourselves and ensure that the outcomes are equitable, sustainable, and trustworthy? And that's really, this issue of trust is so important. And then lastly, what about justice? We need to be equitable and fair, and who decides who decides. So today we have, again, a fantastic lineup of speakers. Before I let them introduce themselves a little bit and we get started, I'm going to launch a poll. And I really want to hear from you, and we'll give it a few minutes here. How do you define smart cities? I mean, I feel like 4 years ago when I started this job, we would define smart cities and it was like, oh my God, it's going to save the world. It's going to be great. Technology is a panacea. And then we sort of realized that it's, the glittery, shiny thing isn't always what it lives up to be. And also, can we reclaim what smart means? Is it who's smart for whom, and equitable? Okay, great. We've got great participation, 65%. I think we got a winner here, which is all of the above. With a second in line is a community that focuses on using technology to address the real world issues and challenges. I had the last one I put in there was a little snarky, none of the above, smart cities don't exist. Because, if you really want to, my question is, can you be a smart city if you have homelessness? Can you be a smart city if you can't breathe the air? If you have food insecurity. So I'm really glad that we had a very kind audience here. So looks like we got a great answer. I'm going to shut the poll now. And Ginger, I'm going to have you, oh good, now you see the results, everybody, right? Okay, good. Should I drop this? I think we're good now. Okay, I'm going to drop the poll so it's not blocking. Ginger, the stage is yours.
Good morning, and thank you for asking me to join you in this conversation. I was telling Karen I love to see how things are evolving in this space. I am the Chief Privacy Officer for the City of Seattle and responsible for several citywide programs that focus on issues around data and data use at the city, including open data, data governance, compliance with a variety of regulatory type stuff. I mentioned privacy and surveillance, and that's where I intersect with this conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. We're going to go on to Tara McGinnis, and I'm so glad you're here, our author. We're so happy to have you with us, Tara.
Thank you. It's great to be here. This is an amazing panel. I've had a chance to be in some conversation with them. I am Tara McGinnis. I founded the new practice lab at Numerica. It's a lab focused on the nexus of where policy meets delivery around family, economic security, and well-being. And most recently rejoined after 7 months leading the domestic policy team for now President Biden. And like many of you, I do teach this body of work to students at Georgetown's McCourt School.
Fantastic. We're so happy to have you with us, Tara. And for those of you who sent in questions in advance, you're all getting a copy of Tara's new book. So thank you for your input. And thank you, Tara. Congratulations on that. Sarah, please welcome and please introduce yourself today.
Hi, everyone. Really great to be here with you. I'm Sarah Truhaft. I'm Vice President of Research at PolicyLink, which is a national research and action institute based in Oakland. Our mission is advancing racial and economic equity, so I come to it from that perspective. And we have a relatively new project, which I think will lead to more work focusing on technology, especially starting with big tech and the big tech business model and developing a framework for thinking about racial equity in relation to regulation of big tech and ensuring that what we get is advancing racial equity.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And definitely my CMU cohort, last but not least, definitely Alante, please introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Karen, and I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation. My name is Alante Whitmore. I am in the final year of my joint PhD here at Carnegie Mellon. I am studying civil engineering and engineering and public policy here, and my work really looks at how we can improve equity through shared automated mobility with autonomous vehicles, with autonomous shuttles, and how can we improve equity, improve the environmental, or reduce environmental impact rather, and also do so in a cost-efficient way. So I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation, as transportation is so integral to smart cities and connected cities. And again, really happy to be here.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to stop my share with my screen. I think I'm going to share the results. I'm hoping you can see this again. Can you see the rankings here? Okay, cool. So we're going to take just a minute. Did this surprise you? So the findings were, which is great. It's like my mission at Metro 21. But were you surprised about some of the findings? And Ginger, I'm going to call on you first.
What are smart cities and how do people think of them? I think it's evolved. I think we had this conversation, if anybody was listening in the last first couple minutes before we started. I think we were all excited about the potential for the technology, what it could do, and where we'd end up. And I think from the city's perspective, we can't afford a lot of that. And there are concerns around things like surveillance and how much information we scoop up. And I don't know about Pennsylvania, I haven't made that a study, but the state of Washington has a very robust Public Records Act, meaning that any information we collect as a city is likely going to be requestable. And that could be really a problem depending on the kind of information that's collected. So I kind of think of what are intelligent cities. I kind of like to think more of a connected city. How do we connect to information and make information useful? I look at it as how does it serve our community needs and how can we be thoughtful about what we can do as we discussed and maybe what we should be doing because of the other mandates and things that we need to do as a city. So that's where I kind of land.
All right, great. Any thoughts from other folks from the panel on the definition of smart cities and what they think about the nuances that have evolved?
I'm happy to jump in, Ms. Tara, over here in this box. I used to have a colleague, Megan Smith, who was the chief technology officer of the United States of America. And she used to say, the internet is us, that I think there's a feature about this technology of like, what is a city been through time? And And how do you maintain that kind of core community definitions in light of transportation looking different and technology looking different? And at one point, I don't think anyone was debating like, does the horse and buggy change who we are as New Yorkers or, or Washingtonians? So I think thinking about how the technology is in service of our core values, how it advances them, not undercuts them, is where what really awoke for me in looking at this very interesting poll from all of you. In our book, we talk a lot about the technology as not a alternative place to live, but something that advances what has been true about us and how we connect for hundreds of years.
Amen. That's well said.
Go ahead. Oh, I just going to say quickly, I had somebody mention to me once, maybe we need smart enough cities. Maybe we really smart cities, just smart enough. Maybe.
Great. Sarah.
Yeah, I would say, I think that I'm not in the smart city space, so it's a less familiar term to me as potentially for you all. And I do think of it mainly like technically as the second piece, the community that's using technology to address real world issues. But I appreciate the all of the above answer, because I think that that's the one I did ultimately select, since our focus is on creating equitable cities, right? And I think that I appreciate that most people saw addressing these inequities as a critical part of being a smart city. And what I think about is the curb cut effect. So this is a theory that Angela Glover Blackwell has written about in Stanford Social Innovation Review. I'll try to add a link to the article, but basically the idea that if you design for those who are most marginalized, most excluded, most vulnerable, right? If that's your design challenge, like homeless people, right? If you focus there, then you will design solutions that end up benefiting everyone, that will have catalytic effects or trickle up effects, right? That everyone will benefit from those solutions, like the curb cuts on the sidewalks that were created because of the advocacy of people with disabilities. But anybody who runs, anyone who carries luggage, anyone who has a stroller, right? We benefit from those curb cuts, and you can apply it in a lot of different contexts. So I think that ultimately, if you embrace that equity component of smart cities, you will be smarter, have a better city, have a more intelligently designed city that delivers on equity.
Well said. Ginger, I saw you unmuted yourself. And then Alante, I'm thinking about the avenues of hope concept. So I'm hoping you can speak to that in a second. Ginger, go ahead.
No, I will mute.
Okay, Alante, go for it.
Sure. I was just happy to see that the forefront is the fact that smart cities are based on community, and the fact that we're emphasizing the fact that that is the priority when we're making these decisions and when we're implementing or introducing new technology into these communities. And I think Sarah made a great point about when you are addressing the needs of those with the greatest need, there's going to be an impact for everybody, even if you're not maybe a part of that group, which I feel like also is happening with the avenues of hope, that these these areas that we've picked in Pittsburgh to provide or to emphasize increased transit service or trying new technology in those services as pilot areas, that provides an opportunity for us to make a lot of improvements that are going to improve anyone even driving through these neighborhoods or going on these streets, as well as individuals who actually live in that community. So I was excited to see that individuals recognize who are here that smart cities are not just one thing, and it's not just a bunch of sensors, it's not just that, but really an opportunity to really do some good and even right some wrongs from the past.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. Let's talk about the theme. I'm really grateful. We have some good conversation coming in from emails and from the chat, but I want to talk about this issue of justice, because that's where we started. And Sarah, I hope it's okay that we thought that this idea of kind of defining justice and how our definition of justice, it needs to expand and change based on the emergence of technology. And I think you can probably speak to some of the work that you've been doing on this topic.
Sure. So so instead of defining justice, I think I'm more comfortable defining equity. They are very parallel, but I'm just a little more comfortable with that. And our definition of equity is just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. So I love that definition because it is both about the individual and the societal level. But basically, I think that, so I think justice is very parallel, but I just think there's a kind of a connotation with the legal system and like distributive justice that makes it a little more confusing, but for me, maybe. So I think that the definition itself of, say, equity doesn't really need to change necessarily, but we need to kind of constantly keep up with the forces of inequity or injustice, right? Like we live in a society that is racist. I mean, systemic racism exists in our society. Many people in our society were awoken to that. Because of George Floyd, in the past, couple of years with the pandemic, we saw how we saw these inequities that continue to exist, right? So I think that awareness has to be the starting point. We sort of need to assume that a new technology will exploit existing inequities, just like the pandemic did, right? So I think that there was like a moment with the pandemic right at first where we were like, oh, it's like an equal opportunity pandemic. And I think those of us at
we're all in this together. And it's like,
right? When we there is some truth to that. There is some truth to that. We all experienced it, but we experienced it so differently, right? And at first there was this, and at Policy Link, we're like, there's no way that it is going to be that. Of course, that it's going to be inequitable. So I think that when we think about technology is an accelerant, right? It's going to exploit existing inequities. So that just requires us to acknowledge systemic racism and inequities exist, and think about what are the factors that perpetuate that, and really step back and analyze how might this new thing that we are introducing into a racist system perpetuate or reinforce those existing inequities. And then we need to be really conscious about designing it in a way, like having a choice, right? Like thinking about it is a choice how we use this new technology, the way in which we deploy it. And
well,
then
I think that's a really great way. I'm going to thank you, Sarah. And I don't want to cut you off, but Ginger, this is like, that's a little softball straight to you, because, live in the, Seattle, city of Seattle, you live in that, you're living that. So talk to us about your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think that is a nice lead into the next question, which was really about inequitable deployment of some technologies. And I think there's a couple ways I can speak about that. From the city perspective, not all of our departments are funded equally. So the folks that have money get to play with some of the technologies that are coming their way. So the utilities, we happen to have a electrical and utility at the city. With automated metering technology, which was an interesting idea. How do you get to a smart grid? You got to know what you're using, got to know micro measurements. You really got to know what you're doing. If you want to opt out of having that information collected, it's going to cost you some money. So inequities around how you opt out of some things that you may not want to participate in. I don't want you to know all the details about my electrical usage. I have concerns about what that could be used for. That's one thing. Department of Transportation also has a lot of interest in this area, and a lot of the entrepreneurial sort of push is around technologies around traffic. Only really affects folks who are either interacting in the environment in such a way that traffic management is important, or are trying to get around because they have a vehicle. How does that also help mass transit? How does that also help other ways that we get around and use our community roads and surfaces? So a lot of money put into things like parking sensors and things that really are specific to people who are vehicle rich, right? The other thing that I can mention around inequitable deployment is relying on smartphone technology. Not everybody has that or has access to internet. And so suddenly we're talking about those with and without personal technology so they can interact in such a way that connected communities make sense. And that's where we see it pop in. But the other really important part, my privacy hat, is the kinds of information that are being collected about folks that are interacting with these systems. So we had a vendor come in, want to give us free bus platforms and kiosks, and it was going to be wired in with a marketing screen, and that's kind of what they were going to share.
I know which company you're talking about, Link.
There you go. And they were gonna share the revenue with us. Hey, we're gonna give you $100 million over 20 years. This is such a great deal. Go do this. But when we looked at the kind of information that people that connect to the internet, the free internet, what they were connecting and collecting, we had to say, wait a minute. Are you helping underserved communities without internet, or are you doing? I think you're really doing this other thing. But that's the public-private tension. You know, who's developing these technologies and for what purpose? And so we very much have to have that hat on as we interact with technology proposals from our different departments. How are you protecting privacy? Are there settings, to Sarah's point? Because there are options here. You know, do we have to collect all that? Can we collect a little bit of that? What is the tension here between what we're collecting from individuals who are trying to interact? And when we do try to connect or do try to serve underserved populations, we find there just aren't technologies in place. So human services, homeless, we got to build apps, we got to build things, and then we're collecting a whole lot of information about a vulnerable and underserved population that then can be disclosed because of our laws around public disclosure. So I hope that gives people a little bit of a flavor of what it feels like on the city side as we get these great ideas that do a whole lot of things we didn't intend, but also are only serving a portion of the population. What are we doing about some of the underlying fundamental issues? If you walk through the streets of Seattle, you'll see how many people are sleeping on the streets. You'll see how many people are just not part of the community that this new shiny world would purport to assist. So that's, I think, what I can offer.
Well said. And I think it's a good lead into the next question, which is for you, Alante, and talking about unintended consequences when there is a deployment of technology. Would love to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, I had like some thoughts prepared, but even in our conversation, what came to mind also was like the location of those deployments and who wants that deployment in their location or in their community and not, and how do we even determine if you're emphasizing equity and decide this one neighborhood, but this neighborhood doesn't want this new technology in the space, how do you remedy that? That's something that just came to mind. I wanted to kind of make sure I shared that as we were starting this conversation, because that can be some of the unintended consequence of there's actually not a desire for this new technology in a space, and you can't thrust it upon a community if they're not in a place to receive it. And it might be from an education standpoint, there might be also some distrust from past experiences. There's a lot of different things that can contribute to that. So we have to consider that when we're thinking about where we're putting these deployments, where we're doing these pilot projects as well. But in the work that I do in transportation and autonomous vehicles, when we think about deployment of these types of this technology specifically, there's all types of things that people are concerned about. I mean, number one thing that everyone's concerned about and talking about the most is like safety and how to determine how safe is safe enough. And that's really important, I think, but I have really moved on in my work into like, how is the benefits of a technology distributed in a neighborhood, in a community, in a city, and how do we make sure that we have it as close to equity as possible, if not just it simply being equitable. That's really, really, really important, and something that I think we have to always consider, in addition to like with equity, that could be with the technologies such as like a VMT increase, so more individuals using the roadways because they can now drive from their home to their, to their job and have the car drive back home. So does that mean those unoccupied trips are now impacting, say, a neighborhood that's lower economic status, and they are now having more noise because there's more trips and there's potential for emissions if it's using a conventional engine. Those are some things that we don't always consider. And then also, I'm kind of going to round back to the safety. If only certain affluent neighborhoods and affluent communities have access to the technology, that means there's going to be a skew of crashes and accidents in neighborhoods that individuals can't afford this new technology, which is why I really emphasize the idea of shared mobility and how that can really help us with that distribution.
Perfect. Perfect. Well said. Sarah, thanks for taking over the chat here. I want to kind of loop in this issue that we were talking about, and Alante kind of hinted at it also, is the data. And, like this question, I can't remember her name, she's from NYU, like who decides about data? And this is something, Ginger, I know you can talk to, but Sarah, I'm going to let you comment and then I'm going to have Ginger jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that these issues, the data question is so difficult because of, even if you do have, just like, how do you make it really clear to people what they are giving up with their data? I just think I don't know the answer to it, but I think it's really, really tricky. So really important to think about. And I would just point to underlying this is unequal power. Who has the power to decide? And I think we'll get into it, but really important questions around who is at the table when deciding, right?
Inclusion. Like I learned a lot about I didn't understand how important inclusion was. It's not just about diversity. It's not just about equity, but you got to have, like, I don't know, it's something about, like, you're planning a party, you make sure everybody gets an invite, you make sure everybody can come to the time, and then you make sure that people are allowed to add to the guest list. Like that's what it's about. Sorry to kind of drill it down.
Absolutely.
But if you don't have a chance to decide who's around the table, that's not inclusion. And sometimes it's like unknown unknowns. You don't realize that a person isn't at the table because you're not aware of that person. But if the person comes and says, I want to be at the table, you build a bigger table, right?
I mean, there's this common saying of advocates, right? Like, if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. And it's true, I think it really encapsulates truth.
Good. Ginger, thoughts?
Boy, I just went down this whole thing around public engagement. I could get you here for an hour and talk about our experiences with surveillance and our surveillance ordinance and the same 10 people that show up with the same 10 concerns. It does not represent a community. I guess my point would be that who decides? It's whoever shows up for the conversation, and not everybody knows the conversation is going on or care enough to show up. I mean, that's the thing. It's how you set the question. So what's happening in the city of Seattle right now, it ends up being departments who see a monetary or other kind of operational value to a technology that they feel is hitting the mission for the city. My mission, Department of Transportation, is to make safe and effective, I'm totally mashing whatever their mission statement is, but environment and safety is a big part of that. But who all is saying, is that more important than this thing over here that maybe doesn't have a price tag or a monetary kickback to it? How do we decide what's most important? And then we look at our elected officials, and they only know what they know. And it's a bright, shiny thing this month. It's something else next month. And so to me, smart cities requires a strategy and a strategic vision that continues on past the offices of the electeds that switch every 2, 5, 6 years. And that's what most of us probably don't have, is that kind of city-long 20-year vision of how we're going to move along. Departments have that, and so we pulled into those conversations. But I don't think I don't know, I'd love to hear, is there city leadership around the country that has that long-term vision that will outlast the person elected into the office that
Tara, this is like a perfect setup to your work. And I thank you. I apologize we haven't had you speak as much, but please, like, this is your book in talking about the role of the power to the public and how do you ensure that voice. So can you speak to that, please?
Sure. I mean, I think in brief, in Power to the Public, we make the case that there are, if you look around the world, at people who are having profound results on sticky social problems, from ending homelessness to making mental health services scalable, no matter what language you speak and where you live. There are these common things that people who are having profound success are doing, and they get right into this conversation about who's at the table and whose data and who decides. And so we saw a pattern, which was basically people who are changing the world are using data differently, using data to be able to see both a problem, but to instrument, hey, we tried a solution. Is it working? Can we tell if it's working? So thing one is they use data, but real-time data. Thing two, data is not enough. you often miss something in the data, or who's missing from the data set completely, without some, call it user research, call it community engagement, representative community engagement. So, Ginger, all the time I think about this challenge as a reformed urban planner. You open the meeting, it's at a certain time. That is unto itself a locked door for people who have time, which is a subset of people and not a subset of other people. But you could know using data, hey, if we looked at our city, there are cohorts. There are 24 people who you could probably interview and have a coffee with where they are at that moment and learn trends that are truly representative, as long as you pick the right 24. And this is where user research paired with big data, I think, is incredibly important. If you are here and you are doing smart city work and all you are doing is looking at numbers, you are doing data wrong. We make the case that the people who are having transformational change somehow get out of their offices and get in an open-ended loop, not a structured survey, with people, and you learn what you didn't know as an expert to ask. And then the third piece is, hey, all that work on data and kind of user research or engaging people is worth nothing if your organization, your office, your team does not have the culture to learn and change what is not working, then it's for naught. And we have a ton of great data work that doesn't result in any transformational change. So the book is fundamentally about these three kind of pillars of work, showing up in a wide range of spaces. I think the thing I would say is, like, it doesn't have to be that fancy. You may not need a user research team in order to creatively ask the most frequently called question to some call center. You can do a lightweight version of this, and by being really engaged in a constant feedback loop, rather than a feedback loop for where should we put this road, or how am I going to remove the, reconsidering the stoplights, like being in a loop between the public and the collective officials. So that's a mouthful for me on it, but I think it really does give a guidepost. There are people who are doing this, and it is having a profoundly different impact. And I know that some of you are among those folks, but it really means grounding into the people you serve as a first and last principle.
Well said. Buy the book. All right, Ginger.
I think I would just say that the engagement with the public is such a complex thing, and that people are put in charge of making decisions who aren't part of that, like smart, how do you do that effectively? And an interesting example of that is we have a surveillance ordinance of the city. That's another hour-long conversation about how that's going. But one of the components of that is a supposition that surveillance is inequitably, disparately used, technologies, et cetera. And so assumptions are made about things like CCTV coverage around the city. We don't want more cameras. We had a community come to us and say, no, more cameras. We want all the cameras. Give us all the cameras. We have street crime we're dealing with, parks kids can't go into. Now, whether cameras solve that or not, that's a whole other conversation, but not hearing the voice of the community specifically around what the problems are they're trying to solve. It's interesting that we get into a political position around and make a decision on behalf of others without really inviting the conversation. Because you may find that, hey, it's way more important to me that I could send my kid to the park and know they're safe than to know there's a camera watching. Actually, that camera makes me feel a little better. So that's what I would say about public engagement. You get the same 10 people, as I joke about, because they have a very concerted agenda and an idea about what they think the right thing is, but we need all voices, and it's so hard to do. So Tara, come lead us in Seattle and tell us how to do that better. I'll read the book, I'll learn more.
I'm really grateful.
I will come to Seattle any day.
Okay.
Ginger, you're a busy person. And also, I'd say other parts of Seattle are the model for this. There's a team grew out of the innovation work that was back to like Backbone, decades of investment in how you'd use data, who now is really thinking like, wow, turns out we have dozens of things we offer the residents of Seattle, and people don't know about them. So couldn't we have one place where you sign up once and then you're like, oh, you're eligible for this park pass for your kids. You might also be eligible for SNAP. I think there's really creative work happening, and I will come any day to Seattle to help you out.
Perfect.
Alante, I'm curious, as a researcher, your thoughts on this issue.
I'm also like in the chat, but I think that honestly, Ginger and Tara have brought up some really, really great points. I feel that I have concerns again about how we get people involved. I feel more anecdotal in this space since I don't have a lot of interface with the public as it relates to my work. However, I recognize like I'm from a single parent household where my mother was working 2 jobs and in school at night. This was not a priority to be involved in policy changing, even though that's actually a place that she actually is very excited about and does do work now that I'm an adult.
Well, she raised you.
Yeah, so she could be involved
That
in
was our
policy quite a bit,
contribution.
but she just didn't have the capacity to do that when she was raising a child. And so I think about how I'm sure she could provide a lot of insight to individuals like Ginger back in the 80s and 90s. And but just that capacity to do so, it just isn't there when there's a lot of other more pressing or conflicting priorities.
Perfect. And I'll just anecdotally, so the work that Metro 21 is doing, we're part of a regional initiative led by the Southwestern Pennsylvania Commission looking at broadband inequity. And so there's all these maps, and eventually these maps are going to determine who's going to get the equity, the investment of broadband when the infrastructure bill passes. And we need to ensure that it's done equitably. So it just can't be who has service and who doesn't, but it's also the other layer of like, who also doesn't have a car, who also doesn't have a high school education, who also is on, getting SNAP benefits. So to understand that socioeconomic, it's complicated. It's a multi-headed hydra. So what we're doing is a survey. And we're also doing community conversations. We're going out to 15, within the 10 county region, we're doing 15 conversations around the community, rural and urban. And then we're also doing stakeholder meetings, I think 10. And so it's the idea that we're and I call it's like call and repeat. It's like, this is what we heard from the data. This is what we heard. Is this what you said? And I think it's got to be that iterative. It takes a long time, but then you ensure that what you're building is equitable. So, okay, I'm seeing some awesome stuff in the chat here. And let's see, I think Ginger and Sarah are getting at it, talking about data. Anybody want to speak up on what's going on in the chat? This is great.
I had referenced our public records laws in the state of Washington. And so when I talk about privacy, mostly I'm talking about limiting data collection with our departments, because anything we do is going to be available for secondary purposes. That becomes the concern. And somebody had mentioned that in the chat about San Diego and traffic cameras. We have a surveillance ordinance, which is supposed to address some of the issues of who has access for what purpose. You put up a camera to do one thing, you shouldn't be using it for something else. But very hard one state has created to keep it in a box. And that's the thing that we try to make all of our departments know. And I have one example, if I may, from Department of Transportation. They were trying to make kids walk back when we walked to school. Okay, school's starting again, so hopefully kids are doing that again. But when kids are walking to school, making it safer for kids to go to school. So they wanted to put out a survey to all school-age families and come up with ideas about, how does your kid get to school? What is the route? What is their gender? What is their age? Do they walk alone? They go down the list of all the things they wanted to know. And we took one look at the survey and said, you don't want to collect that information because you don't want anyone else to have access to that information, because you've just given a roadmap to people with probably bad intentions. So it's figuring out what are you trying to accomplish with the data that you're collecting, because you always got to think about the secondary, tertiary, who else might want access to that. I don't want to know immigration status. I really, really don't, because that can be used by other people for other purposes. So it's an ongoing thing. And that's the thing everyone must realize when cities do this work, some form of public records, and some places can say that's too private and it's protected. We have like 13 exemptions in the city, and they're very, very limited. So that's something for all of us to be aware of. And so we talk about settings and privacy settings. It's de-identified information. It's aggregated information. It's not, I don't want specific stuff. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can't remember where I was. It was actually, it's a Marshall Plan for Middle America, did a series of workshops, which is great. If anyone wants to check that out, highly recommend it. And the speaker was talking about how she doesn't like aggregated data. because she wants the granularity to really understand. So it's that balance. Like for you, Ginger, you need to make sure that there's nothing personal, no personal identifiable information gets out. And for the work that we do at CMU and the research, we have an IRB that kind of so it's a balance. But then you also want to get that richness and understanding what the issues are. And sometimes if it's aggregated too much, you can't get to it.
We have discussions about, do you need the location data to the 6th decimal? Really? Can you get away with 3? Is 2 good? Like, how much do you really need? Because when you're doing 6 decimals, like, where I am within what, 10 inches? I mean, that's personal, right? So that's what we come to, is location data is personal, and we get away from PII. To me, it's anything linked or linkable to an identifiable individual. So route of traffic, route of pattern. We have, micro traveling information coming from scooters and others, and and bikes and all that. And we don't want, I know you can collect. Don't do that. Do it in a way that doesn't tell me direct routes, so I can follow an individual. Those are the kinds of considerations we work.
Absolutely. Good. Any other comments from? Tara, you unmuted. Go for it.
I'm happy to jump in because I think there's both the flip of like, make sure we don't have it so we don't use it for harm. And then there's sometimes we're looking at something that we think shows us a problem and it doesn't represent our voices. There's a great story, I could pop it into the chat, about New York City, which has its seasonal work in rat abatement that we investigated. And at the time, the city used a data set, and the data team was asked to pull up the areas the city should focus on for rat abatement. And the chief data officer at the time got the files in his hand and did what any normal person does when they get a data file of the city they live in. He looked at his zip code where he grew up and said, like, it's kind of interesting. Bed-Stuy projects, no rats anywhere. Sent back to the team. He was curious. He did sort of what I was describing before. He called someone who lived in the same building he grew up in and said, like, what's the deal? No more rats in Bed-Stuy? He said, of course we have rats. We have rats. And then double check the data source, single data source for the explanation of the rat problem, 211. He asked his friend, how come you don't call 211? He said, what's 211? I think really thinking about how we understand a problem. And if you're about to spend, for New York City, what would have been millions of dollars on rat abatement from a single data source, that you could have talked to 10 people in 10 neighborhoods by like buying them coffee and found out probably more about rats than this source. I think it also gets to, hey, you didn't have a chief technology lead for your city who wasn't from a neighborhood in your city, that represents a diverse set of neighborhoods. This goes back to, Karen, your table, the breadth of what diversity and inclusion means, and that you could have really great racial diversity in City Hall, but not represent your neighborhoods pretty well, and you will miss a lot of things that are happening. And so I think really thinking about where the talent in a public sector partnership or in a research partner meets the data set, this I think this highlights so many parts of what the ideal looks like, right? And how you catch what you would not otherwise not see at all. And this is Amin Ram Mashariki, who's done incredible work in this space, as a story about rats. But I think back to prevention, as Ginger has described, mission critical, but also in even how we size up what a problem is, being really careful about the sets and the sources and who's reading the data.
Great. Well done. Perfect question from the audience. Sarah, this is right up your alley. I don't know if you saw it, talking about community engagement and how do you identify community leaders? And it's actually a question we got from the folks sent them in advance. How do you identify who the stakeholders are? How do you, like if I'm a student and I come here for 4 years or 2 years, or I'm visiting, like, who, and then this issue of citizen, I've actually been told that the word, and I get it, like saying the word citizen has a connotation that is, has a double-edged sword, citizen, illegal citizen, like that kind of stuff. And so it's more about community. So can you speak to identifying stakeholders, identifying, who you're trying to help and represent?
Yeah. I think that I hate the word stakeholders. I hate it. I think that it has this sense, I know that, I mean, I'm trained as a planner too, right? And it's like everyone has a stake, but everyone doesn't experience things equally. So I think that I much prefer the community leaders, right? Because I think that it's, you know, thinking about who is, knowing that there can be these inequitable impacts. We need to think about who needs to be included, who might be harmed, you know, who is a group that has been excluded, that has been marginalized, that has been discriminated against. So I think that it's really prioritizing those groups, which you can easily identify. And then I think that in most communities, low-income communities of color, there are rooted organizations that work with residents. And I think that those are really great leaders to include in the conversation, you know, the ones that are delivering services that are reaching the populations that are often missed and that can't go to those meetings, right?
They
that
build trust.
Right? There is no trust. And we did see, like, during the pandemic, the places that had excellent vaccine campaigns, you know, that were able to distribute rental assistance, rent relief, right? It went through those institutions in marginalized communities with those connections. So that's one place to start.
That's great, Sarah. And I mean, my personal experience of working in the pandemic and working with school districts also, it was the school districts that they were the center of hub for like food insecurity issues for children. And if they had a good relationship with their community and the community resources, and there was transparency and there had been communication before the pandemic, they actually fared really well. And then there's examples where it didn't, because there had been this bifurcation, this distrust between the municipality and the school district. I mean, sorry, Pittsburgh, city of Pittsburgh happened here, and it was a cluster for the kids. And there was, you know, remote learning the whole academic year, which is horrible for all those kids, affecting mainly low-income kids because of the majority that are going to the public school system. So in any case, I could go on. Ginger, go for it.
From a city point of view, public engagement is incredibly difficult. There's not a lot of funding for us to figure out how to do this appropriately. The folks that are tasked with doing it don't have the funds, the resources, or maybe the skill set to find the right leadership. When we've thrown a lot of parties around surveillance, we have thrown a lot of public engagement events at libraries, at City Hall, online. We get, as I said, the same 10 people, we get the same perspectives. It's people highly engaged in the topic. They may not have a balanced view of this, but we're certainly getting a perspective, and it's all our elected officials are seeing. And I'm thinking right now of one individual who's a student who's very involved in cybersecurity. And so that's all she wants to talk about. And it gives a skewed perspective of the concerns about cybersecurity when it's the same person doing the same commenting over and over and over again. So doing it in a way that you've reached out to the right folks. There's language barriers. We were throwing these parties and throwing these events and being required to collect demographics about the people who are attending. So let's talk. We're going to have a public engagement meeting. We want to hear from people about their concerns about surveillance. By the way, tell me all about yourself so that I have the demographics collected. And don't worry about that. Don't worry that I'm collecting your gender and your age and where you live and, you know, and your name. Don't worry about that. So because that was the law as it was written. So these barriers to understanding one another as we invite people in to have a conversation, and then what are we going to do about it? And some of these topics can be very technical, and that's something we haven't really touched on. Smart city type technology can be a technical conversation that can be very off-putting for people. If you don't put it in the right way, by our law, we're supposed to talk about these surveillance technologies in a certain way, and it's all very technical, and we have all these questions about data use and all these things. And the average person is going to look at that and go, that has nothing to do with me. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, cameras. Okay, now okay, so you're talking about the camera on the corner of blah and blah and what it's doing. Oh, now I'm with you. But it's how we cage that conversation. And the technical parts of this can be very off-putting and attract a certain group of people who do understand it. Maybe not part of the community you're trying to reach out to get their opinion. Alante's shaking her or nodding her head with me because it sounds like something that you are involved in. Am I kind of capturing? I'm sure it's not just Seattle.
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely agree, because I think that is so important, is like, how do we communicate these things? In the autonomous vehicle space, there's an organization I always forget, either pave or save. I always forget, but it's all about autonomous vehicle education and educating the public on the benefits, the unintended consequences, and being able to communicate this, science communication or technology communication is so important for this exact reason, right? If we're communicating it, these surveillance cameras and sensors, people, your everyday person who's not in the space, they're not going to know about these things. They're going to gloss over, their eyes are going to glaze over in these conversations. And the way that we communicate the technology and what's happening in these cities is just so important, and also going to be useful for us to receive useful feedback so that we can do our job, or as city planners or wherever you are in the landscape of helping to make change. And so I guess as I was thinking, yes, this is so important. And I think sometimes it's well, why isn't anyone engaged? Okay, it's also almost a marketing thing, right? How are you communicating and campaigning these projects?
And we talk about what cities collect. I mean, people don't know what this does, right? And I want to say, well, what are the settings on your phone? I know you're worried about what I'm doing, but let me tell you, we're not that organized. I mean, we collect data, but we aren't using it the way you think we are. These guys are organized. I mean, from marketing perspective and how data is being collected about people and used, that's some organization. And we're seeing that play out with Facebook and, our friends who are having some conversations on the Hill right now. I think that's the thing, but it's educating people on what the risks and benefits are of the kind of data required and the kind of services being provided.
Sarah, this seems like a good place for you to interject, given your work on the role of data and privacy and working with the big four on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, our regulators are just starting to understand what the business model is and the role of data-driven services and how it powers the internet, right? So I absolutely agree with Ginger about just sort of the veil of secrecy behind it, and just it is really important. I think what I was thinking about actually is in cities that are suburbs, not big cities, and thinking about the lack of institutions there, sort of the less developed city infrastructure, right, to even have this surveillance ordinance. And so I think that technology has developed so quickly and nobody has caught up with it because they've sort of been able to mask what's happening. And, we need to so the regulation has not caught up with it, right, at the federal level. We're just having that discussion now, yet cities who are so cash strapped and, need to be more efficient to deliver services, I think a lot of cities are in the place of adopting technology without having the capacity bandwidth to really examine it, right? So I think Ginger is showing us the best case scenario, but I think we need to be worried about places that haven't developed that muscle to make those clear decisions.
Yeah, well said.
The thing to be most concerned about are the technology companies and vendors coming in and saying we'll share the revenue model because so many cities are strapped and towns, small places, and that's where it sneaks in, and that's where you have these conversations. It's really the push between public-private. The private sector is going to do what makes money. That's how we run in this country. And so, is that in alignment with what a city's mission is? Sometimes, but we have to be mindful of what that can introduce. And, we're not solving the big issues of cities right now, that our downtown cores are turning into homeless shelters. They're turning into encampments. They're turning into places that are not supporting an active and vibrant community. How are we going to solve those problems? And then, the private sector comes in. We had somebody come in and say, oh, we're going to help you know who's around and what the traffic patterns are and what are happening, because they wanted to be able to sell that information to Starbucks and other places to say, hey, there's a coupon right now. If you're on the corner of 5th and Pine and there's a coupon available to you if you just walk into that Starbucks. And that's an interesting marketing model, but is it solving any city problem? I don't really know what that data is going to help with. Maybe traffic patterns a little bit.
Yeah, well said. Tara.
I think there's an asymmetrical nature to this too, right? Which is when you are in government and you are attempting to help people with a city service, you have very few of these tools at your disposal. So if you think the proportional effort to sell a cup of coffee, the type of data and user research I described at the front end, Starbucks was a pioneer in, like, whether at this temperature degree on this day in Seattle, you will want a pumpkin latte. There is like more user research than we probably have in whether Americans need access to SNAP and food security. And so like when I was a federal official, we had a bunch of people who were stuck when healthcare.gov was not working, who we knew because they had created a login account. We could not deliver for them at the moment they wanted. The ability to email them back and tell them the site was working was beyond my means as a government official. I knew they were there. They gave us our email. I had not asked for permission structure to email them back. That like, I think thinking about the kind of good in the world when it comes to safer streets for accessing tax benefits, and the selling of products, some of which may be good in the world, pulling more of these tools safely into the ability to do well is a real challenge for public sector leaders, while protecting against the kind of counterpiece, which is, I think companies, as Ginger described, offering a tool that a government doesn't have at a price that they can't refuse. And I think all of this, for those of your students, professors, is the case for a higher level of kind of policy ethics. This is like the beauty of Alante's dual degree, policy ethics. If you are an engineer, that you've contemplated a type of use case problem in your learning that's relevant to the problem you'll face in your work. Also, I think higher level of technical specs among our policy leaders, among our general counsels, really thinking, like, knowing the difference about some of these terms makes a difference in your ability to decide well about it. So I think we've got to grow a lot more fluency of people in all of the seats we have, both in the public and the private space.
I would, yes. I think what you just said is exactly it. And I think it's that the problems that smart city technologies that are being developed in the private sector are solving are not the problems that are foremost for cities delivering services and the missions for which they are focused, right? And that gets even worse as you get into department land. I think everybody likes to think cities are one big, we all know we don't. We at City of Seattle are 40 plus departments doing entirely different things from each other. And so I'm one of the few departments with my citywide sort of scope that get to see how disparate we really are and how we take things on. And the private sector just isn't focused on because it doesn't make money. Feeding people isn't probably going to get you much in terms of market value and all the things that private sector guys are looking for. So that's what smart cities to me are. They're kind of two different views. Cities would love to be smart and solve the problems they want to solve. Private sector isn't really asking what it is you want to solve. They're kind of making it up. And the only place we really see it being vibrant is Department of Transportation, utilities, in our city anyway. That's about where the smart kind of begins and ends. So let's go solve that.
And this is great. I think this is a great place. I'm going to kind of start to wrap things up. I'm going to go back to my share screen here. Let's see, share. And I want to share with you, this has been a fantastic conversation. I want to keep that conversation going. I encourage those in the audience to connect with us if you haven't already. I also want to encourage you to come and join us for more conversations. This is a 3-part series. Our next one is going to be online, November 4th. It'll be talking about mobility and equity and justice. This is a very complicated topic, and we're also really excited that we're going to have, for the CMU community, because of COVID protocols, we're going to do it in person, and we're going to have a conversation. I think our max is 50 people, but we're trying to work out the details to have a more intimate conversation. And Professors Raid Ghani and Sarah Fox are going to be helping me to facilitate that. There's going to be a exit survey. I'm not sure if that's going to, there it is. It's just gone out in the chat. Hey, this has been amazing. I really feel like we've all learned so much. And I want to encourage folks to buy Tara's book. Keep the conversation going. Please send us more questions. And I hope that someday we can do this conversation in person, and we're all going to go to Seattle. I think that's we're all going to come to Seattle.
Come on over.
Great. Excellent. Thanks everybody for a great conversation. Really glad you're here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and fellow panelists. I appreciate it. Bye-bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.